The iron-toothed shadow of her past arrived in Oakhaven not with a gunshot but with the sharp tearing of newsprint. Clara Finch stared at the crumpled front page of the Topeka Daily Capital that Beatrice Cole had deliberately slammed onto the flour-dusted counter right beside a batch of fresh sourdough. Through the thin film of white dust on the mahogany wood, the bold black ink of a 9-month-old fugitive, Notice, stared back at her bearing her own likeness under a name she had tried to bury. Wanted for embezzlement. The sweltering August heat of the bakery kitchen instantly turned to ice in her veins. Beatrice's eyes narrowed with a predatory self-righteous satisfaction, her fingers tapping the paper like a judge's gavel. One wrong word, one tremor in Clara's voice, and the fragile sanctuary she had built in this dust-choked Texas town would shatter into 1,000 pieces. Clara did not flinch. She deliberately picked up her wooden dough scraper, using the flat metal edge to clear the remaining flour from the counter, burying the wanted poster beneath a white drift. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady, a skill learned from surviving months of terror in Kansas. She looked directly into Beatrice's judgmental eyes, her face a mask of calm indifference. "If you're quite finished inspecting the counter, Mrs. Cole," Clara said, her voice smooth and even, "Mr. Sterling is waiting for these loaves in the front of the store. The morning rush does not wait for old news." Beatrice sniffed, clearly disappointed by the lack of tears or panic, but she wasn't finished. She reached into her reticule and pulled out a fresh, crisp copy of the local Oakhaven Gazette, throwing it down over the flour. "Old news from Kansas might not interest you, Miss Finch, but perhaps the local madness will. Though I suppose a woman who lives in a dark storage room wouldn't know much about the decent folks of this county." The omniscient eye of the hill country, watching from the high limestone ridges above the town, knew that Oakhaven was a place built on hidden cruelties. It was a town where people went to church on Sunday mornings and threw stones at outsiders by Monday afternoon. For 8 months, Clara had lived like a ghost behind the rows of canned peaches and burlap sacks of grain in Mr. Sterling's general store. She was 26, entirely alone, and tolerated only because her hands could turn cheap flour into the finest, lightest bread the county had ever tasted. Mr. Sterling paid her $3 a week and allowed her to sleep in the windowless back room. It wasn't charity. It was a highly profitable arrangement for him and a desperate hiding place for her. Clara glanced down at the local paper. Printed squarely in the center of the notice section was a matrimonial advertisement that had thrown the entire town into a frenzy of gossip. Wanted. A wife of good character and strong constitution to manage a large household and ranching estate. In exchange for loyal partnership, the undersigned guarantees absolute legal protection and a lawful transfer of 50% of all land and cattle deeds upon marriage. Apply in person at the Vance Homestead, Northridge. Gideon Vance. "He's a monster," Beatrice whispered loudly, leaning over the counter so the other women browsing the dress fabrics could hear. "A giant of a man who stands nearly 7 feet tall. They say he slaughtered a cattle rustler with his bare hands 3 winters ago and left the body for the vultures. No decent, God-fearing woman would ever ride up into those hills alone. He's looking for a servant to torment, not a wife." The other women nodded in agreement, murmuring prayers of protection against the devil of the hills. But as Clara stared at the ink, a strange, quiet rebellion began to stir in her chest. The townspeople feared Gideon Vance because of his size and the violent rumors that clung to his name. But Clara knew the truth about the world. The real monsters didn't hide in the rugged hills wearing stained leather chaps. The real monsters wore tailored wool suits, gold pocket watches, and smiled warmly while they ruined a woman's life. Her former employer in Topeka, Mr. Vaughn, had been a pillar of the community, a man who attended charity galas while embezzling thousands from his own bank and placing the blame entirely on his quiet young secretary when the federal auditors arrived. If a giant rancher was offering a legal contract, an ironclad guarantee of 50% of his estate, and absolute protection, it meant he valued a partner, not a victim. He was offering the one thing Clara lacked: a fortress. That night, after the heavy oak doors of the general store were locked and the town had fallen into a dusty silence, Clara sat on her small cot in the storage room. The air was thick and stagnant, smelling of cedar shavings and dry yeast. By the dim, flickering light of a brass kerosene lamp, she pulled loose a squeaking floorboard beneath her bed. Hidden in the darkness below was her single inheritance, a small walnut box containing a silver locket with her parents' photographs and a handful of silver coins. She stared at the coins, counting them silently. It was enough to hire a livery mare for a single day, but not enough to buy a train ticket further west if the law in Topeka finally tracked her down. Beatrice Cole's cousin lived in Kansas. It was only a matter of time before the rumors turned into an official telegram to the county sheriff. The walls of Oakhaven were closing in on her, suffocating her just as surely as the summer heat. Clara walked to the small, grimy window that looked out toward the northern horizon, in the distance, rising like dark waves against the starlit sky. Were the limestone ridges of the hill country. Somewhere out there, amid the ancient live oaks and the windswept canyons, lived a man the world hated. A man who had built an empire from the rocks and was willing to share it with a stranger just to cure his own isolation. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window, her decision hardening like iron. She would not wait for the law to find her in this closet. She would not spend the rest of her youth baking bread for a man who hid her in the back like a shameful secret. Tomorrow she would take the ultimate gamble. She would ride into the wolf's den and see if the giant cowboy's heart was as monstrous as the town claimed, or if he was simply another soul looking for a shield against the cruelty of the world. The narrator, guiding the unseen threads of fate, knew that tomorrow's journey would change the history of the valley forever. Clara closed her eyes. The image of the matrimonial notice burned into her mind, unaware of the profound gentleness that awaited her beneath the shadow of the giant. The hired mare's hooves clicked rhythmically against the exposed limestone plates of the hill country road, a stark contrast to the soft, quiet dust of Oakhaven. Clara Finch adjusted her worn wool shawl, though it did little to shield her from the mid-morning heat radiating off the white Kalache soil. The landscape shifted dramatically with every mile she traveled north. The flat, suffocating horizon of the town gave way to rolling, rugged ridges crested with gnarled live oaks that had survived a century of Texas droughts. It was a beautiful, harsh country, utterly indifferent to the small dramas of human existence, and for the first time in 8 months, Clara felt her chest loosen. In Oakhaven, every breath felt borrowed. Here, beneath the vast, cloudless dome of the blue sky, the air belonged to no one but God. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the modern rail fences of the Vance Ranch came into view. Clara reined in her horse, her breath catching in her throat. The town gossips had described Gideon Vance's property as a desolate, chaotic fortress, a reflection of the monster who owned it. But the reality before her eyes was an absolute contradiction. Rows of meticulously maintained cedar posts stretched across 3,000 acres of prime valley land, dividing lush green pastures where hundreds of red-hided Hereford cattle grazed peacefully. The homestead itself was built of solid native hillstone, standing 2 stories high, surrounded by a wide covered porch designed to catch the southern breeze. It was a place of immense wealth, but more than that, it was a place of rigorous, unyielding order. A criminal brute did not build a ranch this pristine, and disciplined, fiercely dedicated man did. Clara rode down the long gravel driveway, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She dismounted near the massive blacksmith shed where the heavy metallic clang of a hammer against an anvil echoed through the valley. As she stepped into the cool shadow of the barn, she saw him. Gideon Vance was working with his back to her, and the rumors about his size had not been exaggerated. He stood 6'5", his massive shoulders stretching the fabric of his sweat-dampened linen shirt. His arms, thick as cedar logs and dark from the Texas sun, swung the heavy blacksmith hammer with effortless precision. He was shoeing a massive, pitch-black draft horse. The beast was visibly frightened, tossing its head and stamping its rear hooves against the dirt floor. Clara braced herself, expecting the giant man to strike the animal, or shout in anger as she had seen so many men in Kansas do. Instead, Gideon set the hammer down. He stepped closer to the trembling horse, leaning his massive frame against its flank. He reached out with a hand large enough to cover Clara's entire face and placed it gently on the horse's neck. He began to speak in a low, gravelly baritone, a sound so deep it seemed to vibrate through the wooden floorboards of the barn. Clara couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was a soothing, rhythmic lullaby. Within moments, the stallion's ears relaxed and its head lowered completely, subdued by the giant's gentle touch. The omniscient eye of the hills knew what the town chose to ignore. Gideon Vance's strength was not a weapon of malice, but a shield of profound restraint. "You're late, Miss Finch," Gideon said without turning around. His keen ears had caught the sound of her horse minutes ago. Clara swallowed the lump in her throat, drawing herself up to her full, modest height. "The livery mare was stubborn, Mr. Vance, but I am here." Gideon turned, wiping his soot-stained hands on a rag. His face was a mask of hard angles, weathered by the elements, with a sharp silver-streaked beard that made him look older than his 34 years. His gray eyes, piercing and completely unreadable, assessed her in a single sweeping glance. He didn't look at her with the predatory hunger of her former boss, Vaughn, nor did he look at her with the suspicious disdain of the Oakhaven churchgoers. He looked at her like a man inspecting a new piece of timber, searching for structural integrity, not flaws. "Come inside," he commanded briefly, leading the way to the stone house. The interior of the homestead was spotless, but intensely lonely. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the polished pecan floors, and no decorative trinkets on the mantel. It was a house built for survival, waiting for a soul to make it a home. They sat opposite each other at a heavy hand-carved oak dining table that smelled faintly of beeswax. Gideon did not waste time on pleasantries. He laid his large hands flat on the table, his eyes locking onto hers. "I'm a blunt man, Miss Finch, so I will give you the truth. The people in that town call me a murderer because I defended my cattle from rustlers 3 winters ago. They fear me, and I prefer it that way because it keeps their hypocrisy away from my gates. But a ranch this size needs a woman's hand. I need someone to manage the household, oversee the smokehouse, and handle the ledgers. I'm not offering you a fairy tale. I'm offering you a legal partnership." Clara stared back at him, refusing to lower her gaze. "And what does this partnership provide me, Mr. Vance?" "Safety," Gideon replied, his voice firm as iron. "On this ranch, my name is law. No one from Oakhaven will dare cross my fence lines to harass you. Furthermore, the day we sign the marriage certificate at the courthouse, a legal deed will be filed transferring exactly 50% of this land and all future cattle profits into your name. If I die tomorrow, you are a wealthy, independent woman. If you leave, you take your half with you." The sheer fairness of the offer left Clara breathless. In Topeka, Vaughn had demanded everything from her, her dignity, her body, her submission, and offered only destruction in return. This giant man, feared by the entire county, was offering her total financial equality and absolute protection before they had even shared a meal. "You speak of truth, Mr. Vance," Clara said softly, her fingers tightening around her skirt. "So I must give you mine. I'm not in Oakhaven by choice. I'm running from a dark shadow in Kansas. A powerful man made me a scapegoat for a crime I did not commit. If you marry me, that shadow might eventually find its way to your door." Gideon leaned back, his gray eyes narrowing slightly as he weighed her words. The omniscient narrator could see the gears of his mind turning, calculating the risks, searching his own scarred past to understand the fear in her voice. He had known injustice himself. He knew how easily a lie could become a town's truth. "Does this shadow have a legal warrant in the state of Texas?" Gideon asked. "No," Clara whispered. "Not yet, but he is a vengeful man." Gideon stood up, walking over to the wide window that looked out over the sprawling green valley. The afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the limestone hills. For a long moment, the house was entirely silent, save for the steady ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, a rhythmic countdown to a decision that would alter both of their destinies forever. "I don't care about Kansas, Miss Finch," Gideon said, finally turning back to face her, his massive silhouette blocking out the light. "And I don't care about ghosts. I care about what a person does on this soil. If you can keep this house, if you can stand beside me when the winter freezes come, then your past belongs to the wind. Think on my offer. If you accept return to the Oakhaven courthouse this Friday at noon, I will have the papers ready." Clara stood up, feeling a strange, unfamiliar sensation blooming in her chest. Hope. It was a dangerous emotion for a fugitive, but looking at Gideon Vance, she knew he was the only man in Texas strong enough to hold back the storm that was inevitably coming for her. She nodded once, a silent agreement, and walked out into the warm Texas air, unaware that back in Oakhaven, the first cracks of that very storm were already beginning to break. The journey back to Oakhaven felt twice as long as the ride out, the afternoon sun beating down upon Clara's shoulders with a relentless heavy heat. By the time she stabled the livery mare and slipped back through the rear entrance of Sterling's General Store, the dust of the North Ridge had settled into the fabric of her skirt, a physical reminder of the choice she had just poised herself to make. She washed her hands and face in the basin, her mind replaying the steady, deep resonance of Gideon Vance's voice. He had offered her an anchor in a world that had done nothing but cast her adrift. Yet as the omniscient presence of the small town dictated no secret remained buried for long in a place where people traded in the currency of other souls' misfortunes. The next morning, the fragile peace Clara had maintained for 8 months crumbled. She was in the middle of preparing the pre-dawn dough, her arms buried to the elbows in a massive wooden trough of flour, when the front bell chimed with a frantic, aggressive rattle. It was much too early for customers. Mr. Sterling had not even unlocked the heavy front shutters. Clara wiped her hands in her apron and stepped out of the kitchen, only to find Beatrice Cole standing in the center of the aisle, flanked by 3 other prominent women from the Oakhaven Altar Guild. Behind them stood Mr. Sterling, his usually placid face pale and sweating, his hands trembling as he fumbled with his pocket watch. Beatrice did not speak initially. She merely pointed a gloved finger at Clara, her expression twisted into a mask of pure self-righteous malice. "There she is," Beatrice said, her voice cutting through the quiet morning air like a rusted blade. "The viper we have allowed to warm herself by our fire. I told you, Mr. Sterling, that there was something unnatural about a woman who arrived with nothing but a single carpetbag and a refusal to speak of her kin." Mr. Sterling looked down at the floor, refusing to meet Clara's eyes. "Clara," he stammered, his voice weak, "Mrs. Cole has received a letter from her sister in Topeka, a letter containing a transcript of a banking trial from last winter. They say a woman named Clara Finch stole over $4,000 from the vault and ruined the reputation of a decent businessman before fleeing the state." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Clara felt the immediate urge to defend herself, to scream that Vaughn was the true criminal, that he had forged the ledgers after she rejected his advances. But she looked at the cold, eager faces of the women before her and realized the truth. They did not want the facts. They wanted an execution. To them, her guilt was already a foregone conclusion, verified by the mere existence of the rumor. "I have done nothing but honest work since the day I arrived in Oakhaven, Mr. Sterling," Clara said, her voice remarkably steady, though her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "The bread on your shelves has kept this store profitable." "Honest work," Beatrice sneered, stepping closer, the scent of lavender water and old lace radiating off her. "You are a thief hiding from the law in Kansas, and worse, you were seen riding out to the Vance Ranch yesterday. You think we don't know what you're planning? You intend to marry that brute to crawl into his fortress so the sheriff can't touch you. You are bringing shame and damnation upon this entire town." One of the other women stepped forward, nodding sharply. "We will not buy bread touched by a criminal's hands. If she stays in this store, Mr. Sterling, we will boycott your establishment. Every decent family in Oakhaven will take their business to the next valley." Mr. Sterling's posture collapsed. He was a man who measured morality entirely by the weight of the coins in his cash drawer. He looked at Clara, then at the wealthy churchwomen, and made his decision without a shred of hesitation. "I'm sorry, Clara," he muttered, still refusing to look at her. "You have to leave. Today. I can't have your trouble ruining my livelihood." "And my wages for this week?" Clara asked, her voice dropping an octave, filled with a dangerous, quiet dignity. "You're lucky I don't call the sheriff to hold you until a wire can be sent to Kansas," Beatrice barked, answering for the store owner. "You won't take another cent of honest Texas money out of this town." The omniscient observer of this bitter drama could see the profound irony unfolding within the wooden walls of the store. The townspeople prided themselves on their Christian charity, yet they were casting a completely innocent woman into the wilderness without a penny to her name, all based on the malicious gossip of a resentful family. Clara stood in silence for a long moment, looking at the people who had consumed her labor for 8 months without ever seeing her as a human being. A strange, liberating coldness washed over her. The fear that had paralyzed her for nearly a year suddenly vanished, replaced by an iron-willed clarity. She didn't cry, nor did she beg. She simply turned her back on them, walked into the small storage room, and packed her single carpetbag. She took her parents' silver locket from beneath the floorboard and placed it carefully around her neck. When she walked back out into the main store, Beatrice and her flock were waiting, expecting her to slink away in shame. Instead, Clara held her head high, her spine as straight as a cedar post. She looked directly at Mr. Sterling. "Your ovens will be cold by tomorrow, sir, and you will find that malice makes for a very poor loaf of bread." She walked out into the bright, blinding glare of the morning sun, her boots snapping sharply against the wooden boardwalk. She had no money, no food, and no shelter. The townspeople she passed stared at her with open hostility, the whispers already spreading down the Kalish street like a wildfire through dry brush. Clara walked directly to the telegraph office at the end of the town. The operator, an elderly man who usually ignored the town's politics, looked at her with a mixture of pity and curiosity. Clara placed her last silver coin onto the counter, the coin she had intended to save for an emergency. She took a scrap of paper and wrote a single line, her handwriting elegant and unfaltering. "Send this to the Vance Ranch," Clara commanded softly. The operator read the words out loud, his eyebrows rising in surprise. "The answer is yes. I will meet you at the courthouse on Friday, Clara." As the telegram clicked away over the copper wires destined for the northern hills, Clara walked out onto the dusty road. She had 24 hours to survive before Friday noon. She knew the town would try to intimidate her, perhaps even try to drive her away before Gideon could arrive. But as she looked toward the rugged blue ridges in the distance, she knew she was no longer running. She was simply waiting for her protector, and God help anyone who tried to stand in his way. Gideon Vance arrived at the northern boundary of Oakhaven exactly 24 hours before the appointed time, sitting atop his massive black stallion like an iron monument against the brassy Texas sky. He held the reins of a second horse, a gentle, deep-chested bay mare equipped with a sturdy leather side saddle. He did not enter the town's center. His sheer presence there would have incited a useless frenzy among the gossips. Instead, he waited precisely where the dusty Caliche road bled into the rugged trail of the North Ridge. When Clara appeared walking along the roadside, her single carpet bag clutched tightly in her ungloved hand, and her chin held high despite the dust coating her throat. Gideon did not offer hollow words of sympathy. He simply dismounted, took the heavy bag from her tired fingers, and secured it to the pack mules behind his saddle. "The clerk will be waiting at the courthouse," Gideon said, his deep baritone cutting through the dry midday heat. He offered his massive calloused hand to help her mount the bay mare. "The whole town is already gathered there. They think this is a funeral, not a wedding." Clara looked up into his gray eyes, finding an immense, unshakable calm that instantly quieted the remaining tremors in her chest. "Let them look, Mr. Vance," she replied, settling into the saddle with a grace that surprised him. "They have already taken everything else they could from me. They cannot take my resolve." The ride into the heart of Oakhaven was a gauntlet of silent hostility. The omniscient perspective of the valley observed the strange procession, the giant rancher whom everyone feared and the disgraced baker woman whom everyone had cast out riding side by side toward the county courthouse. People lined the wooden boardwalks. Shopkeepers stepped out onto their porches, arms crossed tightly over their chests. Beatrice Cole stood on the steps of the dry goods store, surrounded by her inner circle, her eyes burning with a mixture of furious indignation and morbid curiosity. To the town, this marriage was a scandalous tragedy. To Clara, it was the opening of a fortress gate. The Oakhaven courthouse was a small two-story structure built of rough-hewn limestone, smelling faintly of old paper tobacco juice and damp wool. Inside, the county clerk, a bitter, narrow-shouldered man named Greeley, sat behind a high oak counter. He didn't rise when they entered. He merely adjusted his spectacles, looking at Clara with an open sneer before turning his gaze to the giant contract Gideon threw down upon the desk. "This is highly unusual, Vance," Greeley muttered, his ink-stained fingers trembling slightly as he scanned the customized clauses. "A standard marriage certificate doesn't include property deeds. You're legally transferring 50% of the Northridge estate, the cattle tallies, and the water rights to this woman. Effective immediately upon signature. She hasn't been in this county a year, and her reputation in Kansas is... Your job is to witness the signatures and record the deed, Greeley, not to audit my judgment." Gideon interrupted, stepping forward. His massive frame cast a dark, suffocating shadow over the clerk's desk, the sheer physical authority of his presence causing the smaller man to swallow his remaining words. "The papers are drawn correctly by Judge Morrison's office. Stamp them." Greeley dipped his iron nib into the inkwell, his movements sharp and resentful. Clara stepped forward, taking the pen with steady fingers. As she signed her name, Clara Finch, she felt the heavy weight of her old life splitting away. When Gideon signed beneath her, his large sweeping script looked like an iron fence enclosing her name, protecting it from the world outside. Judge Morrison, an aging man with tired eyes who had seen too much of the town's hypocrisy over the decades, stepped out from his private chambers to pronounce them husband and wife. It was a brief, sterile ceremony devoid of flowers or music, but the legal reality of it was absolute. She was no longer a penniless fugitive sleeping on flour sacks. She was Clara Vance, mistress of 3,000 acres of prime Texas land. But the valley's malice was not so easily defeated. As the newlyweds stepped out of the courthouse doors and into the blinding glare of the afternoon sun, they found the path blocked. Beatrice Cole had rallied a small crowd of townspeople at the base of the stone steps. "Enjoy your stolen wealth while you can, Clara Finch," Beatrice shouted, her voice shaking with righteous fury as she held up a fresh piece of paper. "The sheriff just received the official wire from Topeka. The authorities in Kansas have reopened the investigation into the bank vault robbery. They know you're here. They know who you are. This giant might own the hills, but he doesn't own the law. The federal marshals will come for you, and when they do, you'll drag him down into the dirt with you." A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. Clara felt the color drain from her face, her hands gripping the wooden railing of the courthouse steps. Vaughn hadn't forgotten her. He was actively using his influence to hunt her down, pushing the law across state lines to ensure she was silenced forever. Before the crowd could advance or shout another insult, Gideon stepped directly in front of Clara, his broad shoulders completely blocking her from their view. He looked down at the gathering, his face completely expressionless, but his gray eyes burned with a terrifying, quiet violence. He adjusted his gun belt, the heavy leather creaking in the absolute silence that suddenly fell over the street. "She is advanced now," Gideon said, his voice low but carrying across the entire square like distant thunder. "Every blade of grass on the North Ridge belongs to her. Every bullet in my belt belongs to her defense. If a marshal comes with a legal federal warrant, I will speak to him. But if any man or woman from this town sets foot past my gate to harass my wife, they will not return. Disperse." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, the bravest among them suddenly looking down at their boots. No one in Oakhaven was willing to risk their life for Beatrice Cole's malice. Slowly, the gathering began to fracture, people slipping away into the shadows of the boardwalks. Gideon turned to Clara, his expression softening just a fraction as he held the reins for her horse. "We ride home now, Clara. The hills are high and the walls are thick. Let the marshals come if they must. We will be waiting." As they galloped away from Oakhaven, leaving the dust of the hypocritical town behind them, Clara looked at the massive back of her new husband. He had defended her honor in front of the entire world. Yet as the omniscient narrator watched them disappear into the rugged valleys of the North Ridge, a cold truth remained. Gideon had married her for a partner, an honest woman to help him build an empire. He did not yet know the full intricate depth of the lie Vaughn had woven around her, nor did he know that the shadow she brought with her would soon test the very foundations of the iron fortress he had promised to share. The heavy stone walls of the Vance homestead offered a cold, unyielding silence as the newlyweds returned from Oakhaven. The limestone structures that had once seemed like a majestic fortress to Clara now felt like an imposing maze of secrets and unspoken doubts. Gideon dismounted without a word, his face carved from the same hard stone as the hills, his gray eyes fixed on the horizon where the storm clouds of late August were beginning to gather. He led the horses away to the stables, leaving Clara to step onto the wide, barren porch alone. The omniscient presence of the valley, which had watched their dramatic union on the courthouse steps, now looked inside the quiet rooms of the house where the true foundation of their legal partnership was about to be tested by the ghosts of Kansas. Inside the house remained pristine but completely hollow, a physical manifestation of Gideon's isolated existence. Clara set her carpetbag down by the heavy oak table, her hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline from the confrontation with Beatrice Cole finally began to fade. She could still hear the venom in the woman's voice, shouting about the federal wire and the reopened investigation in Topeka. Vaughn was relentless. His influence stretched like tentacles across the map, refusing to let her breathe, refusing to let her find peace, even in the remote ridges of Texas. When Gideon finally entered the house, the sheer scale of his physical presence seemed to shrink the room. He didn't look at her with anger, but with a profound, heavy gravity that was far more terrifying. He walked over to the stone fireplace, leaning one massive arm against the mantelpiece as he looked down at his new wife. The silence between them stretched, punctuated only by the steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. "You told me you were running from a shadow, Clara," Gideon said, his deep baritone unusually quiet, yet carrying an intensity that vibrated through the floorboards. "But you did not tell me that the shadow carried a federal wire. You did not tell me that the United States Marshals would be riding to my gates before the ink on our marriage certificate was even dry." Clara swallowed the lump of fear in her throat, stepping closer to the table to steady herself. I did not know Vaughn would go this far, Gideon. I swear to you. I thought that by fleeing to a completely different state, by changing my life entirely, he would satisfy himself with the money he stole and leave me to the wind. Tell me the whole of it! Gideon commanded, his gray eyes locking onto hers with an unyielding demand for absolute truth. No more omissions, no more half-truths to protect my feelings or your pride. If I am to stand between you and the law, I need to know exactly what weapon I am holding. Clara took a deep, ragged breath, the dam of her secrets finally breaking under the weight of his gaze. She told him everything. She spoke of her arrival in Topeka 3 years ago, a naive young woman looking for honest work to support herself after her parents passed. She described how Vaughn, the wealthy and highly respected president of the Topeka Capital Bank, had taken an interest in her, offering her a position as his private secretary. For a time, she believed he was a benevolent mentor. But then came the late nights in the vault, the subtle shifts in his behavior, and finally the horrific evening when he cornered her in his office demanding her submission in exchange for her continued employment and safety. I refused him, Clara whispered, her voice cracking with the memory of that degrading night, though her eyes remained fierce and clear. I walked out of that bank and told him I would rather starve in the streets than surrender my dignity to a man like him. But Vaughn is a man who destroys what he cannot possess. The very next morning, the federal auditors arrived. Vaughn had spent months systematically altering the financial ledgers, transferring over $4,000 into dummy accounts, and utilizing my private signature stamp to validate every single transaction. He made me the perfect scapegoat. Gideon did not interrupt. His massive body remained perfectly still, but the muscles in his jaw tightened until the bone showed white beneath his weathered skin. The narrator, observing the deep recesses of the giant's mind, knew that this story struck a raw, bleeding nerve within him. Gideon knew exactly what it felt like to be judged by a powerful lie, to have a town look at you and see a monster, because it was easier than looking for the truth. The police came to my boarding house that same night, Clara continued, her hands gripping the silver locket around her neck. A sympathetic clerk warned me just an hour before they arrived. I packed my bag, took the first train south under a false name, and ended up in Oakhaven. I never touched a single cent of that bank's money, Gideon. My only crime was saying no to a predator. A long, agonizing silence settled over the room as Clara finished her confession. She braced herself for his rejection. She had legally married him for his protection, and in doing so she had brought a federal storm to his pristine valley. She expected him to tell her that the contract was void, that he would not risk his empire for a fugitive secretary from Kansas. Gideon turned his gaze back to the window, watching the first drops of rain begin to strike the glass pane. "You should have trusted me with this before we stood before Judge Morrison," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "A partnership cannot be built on a foundation of fear and concealment, Clara." "I was terrified," she admitted honestly, a single tear finally escaping her eye. "Everyone in Oakhaven spoke of you as a man of violence. I did not know who you were. I only knew I needed a hiding place." "You have your hiding place," Gideon said, turning back to face her, his expression unreadable. "I do not break my word, and I do not violate a legal contract. You are my wife, and half of this ranch is yours by law. But trust is not something that can be signed into existence on a piece of courthouse paper, Clara. It must be earned." He walked toward the hallway, pausing at the threshold. "You will take the master bedroom upstairs. I will sleep in the study downstairs until this matter is resolved. Tomorrow we begin the work of managing this estate. We will see if your actions on this soil match the truth of your words." As Gideon disappeared into the shadows of the lower floor, Clara sank into a chair, the heavy silence of the house settling around her once more. The physical fortress had accepted her, but the heart of the giant remained locked behind walls of stone. Yet, as the omniscient eye of the valley watched the rain begin to pour over the gnarled live oaks of the North Ridge, it was clear that the quiet distance between husband and wife would not last long. The labor of the ranch awaited them, and in the shared sweat of the coming days they would either find a way to forge a true alliance, or the gathering storm from Kansas would tear their legal contract into shreds before the winter frost could arrive. The morning sun broke over the limestone ridges of the North Ridge with a blinding golden intensity, casting long shadows across the rugged valleys of Texas hill country. Gideon Vance had left the homestead before the first light of dawn had even touched the eastern sky, leaving only a brief handwritten note on the kitchen table stating he had gone to inspect the northern boundary fences where a pack of wolves had been spotted. Clara stood by the window, watching the dust settle on the trail he had taken. The emotional distance between them, since her confession the previous night, felt as vast and unyielding as the Texas landscape itself. Yet the omniscient narrator of their lives knew that true resilience was not born in the absence of conflict, but in the quiet, stubborn determination to endure beside one another through the heat of the day. Clara refused to spend her morning wallowing in the hollow silence of the master bedroom. She was a woman who had survived the betrayal of a powerful man in Kansas and the cold isolation of Oakhaven. She knew that the only antidote to fear was purposeful, unceasing labor. She rolled up her linen sleeves, pinned her skirts securely, and threw herself into the monumental task of organizing the Vance household. She began in the kitchen, scrubbing the heavy soot from the massive cast-iron stove until the metal shone like polished slate. She moved to the grand living room, washing the dust of the Kalish roads from the windows and sweeping the pecan floors until the scent of cedar and beeswax replaced the stagnant air of Gideon's years of isolation. By midday, Clara had migrated to the outbuildings. She entered the massive smokehouse where hundreds of pounds of cured bacon and salted beef hung from the cedar rafters. The ledgers Gideon kept were meticulously organized in terms of numbers, but the physical organization of the supplies was entirely neglected, the product of a lonely man who worked until exhaustion and had no time for domestic order. Clara began rearranging the heavy wooden crates, shifting bags of salt and barrels of flour to ensure they were protected from the encroaching humidity of the late summer. It was brutal, backbreaking work that strained her shoulders and covered her clothes in fine dust, but it gave her a profound sense of ownership. This was her home now. Half of this empire belonged to her by law, and she would prove to the giant cowboy that she was more than capable of carrying her weight. The afternoon heat had reached its suffocating peak when the accident occurred. Clara was attempting to drag a particularly heavy iron-bound crate of salt blocks from the dark corner of the smokehouse. Her foot slipped on a patch of loose gravel, and as she lunged forward to catch her balance, her right hand scraped violently against a long, rusted iron nail protruding from the wall. The sharp, burning pain was instantaneous. She gasped, dropping to her knees as dark crimson blood began to well from a deep laceration across her palm and fingers. She clutched her wounded hand to her apron, the white fabric instantly staining red, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps as the dizziness of the pain washed over her. "What in God's name are you doing, Clara?" Gideon's voice boomed through the open doorway of the smokehouse, his massive shadow instantly blocking out the blinding sunlight. He had returned early from the northern fences, his keen eyes noticing the open doors of the outbuildings. He dropped his heavy leather saddlebags onto the dirt floor and crossed the room in 3 massive strides, dropping to his knees beside her. His face, usually an unreadable mask of hard stone, was twisted into an expression of intense, sharp anxiety. Without waiting for her permission, Gideon reached out and gently took her injured arm. The contrast between his giant calloused hand and her slender, blood-stained wrist was striking, yet the omniscient eye of the valley observed no violence in his touch, only an absolute, terrifying gentleness. He inspected the deep cut, his brow furrowing in concentration as he lifted her effortlessly from the floor and carried her into the main house, setting her down gently on the heavy oak dining table. He returned from the washroom moments later with a basin of steaming water, a clean linen cloth, and a bottle of strong, burning antiseptic. He didn't speak a word as he began to wash the dirt and blood from her skin, his movements as precise and careful as they had been when he was shoeing the frightened stallion in the blacksmith shed. When he poured the alcohol over the open wound, Clara bit her lips so hard it bled, refusing to cry out in front of him. She watched his face, noticing for the first time the fine lines of exhaustion around his gray eyes and the genuine worry etched into his forehead. "You are a stubborn woman, Clara Vance," Gideon said, his deep baritone unusually rough as he carefully wrapped the clean linen bandage around her palm, tying it with a firm but comfortable knot. He set the basin down and looked directly into her eyes, his large hands resting on the edge of the table, pinning her between his gaze. "I told you to rest. I told you this house was a hiding place for you. You do not need to destroy your hands to prove your worth to me." "I am not a guest in this house, Gideon," Clara replied, her voice shaking slightly from the pain but filled with an unyielding conviction. "And I am not a charity case hiding in your shadows. We signed a contract. I am your partner. If the town is going to boycott this ranch, and if the law is going to come to your gates, I will not be found sitting idly in a rocking chair. I will be standing beside you with sweat on my brow." Gideon stared at her, the hard angles of his face softening just a fraction, as the true depth of her character finally revealed itself to him. He had married her because he needed an honest woman to manage his estate, but looking at her raw, bandaged hands and the fierce pride in her eyes, he realized he had found something far more valuable and equal. A woman who possessed the same rugged, unbreakable spirit that had allowed him to carve an empire out of the limestone hills. He leaned back, a heavy sigh escaping his chest as he ran a massive hand through his silver-streaked beard. "I spent the entire morning riding along the ridge, Clara, thinking about Kansas, thinking about the man who did this to you." He walked over to the fireplace, his broad back to her for a moment before he turned around, his expression completely resolute. "A partnership cannot survive on defense alone. If we simply sit here behind these stone walls waiting for Vaughn's wire to turn into a federal marshal, we will eventually lose. I am a Vance, and I do not allow wolves to stalk my cattle indefinitely." Clara looked at him, her heart skipping a beat. "What are you saying, Gideon?" "Tomorrow morning I am sending a rider to San Antonio," Gideon declared, his voice firm as iron. "I'm going to draw $1,000 from the bank and hire the Pinkerton Detective Agency. I want their best agents to ride to Topeka. They will investigate Vaughn's ledgers. They will find the clerks who know the truth, and they will tear his lie apart piece by piece until your name is as clean in the eyes of the law as it is in this room." He stepped closer to her, his gray eyes burning with a quiet, protective fire. "We are going to fight him, Clara, together. And until that day comes, no marshal and no town gossip will ever cross my fence lines to touch you. That is my oath to you." As the twilight began to fall over the north ridge, casting a deep purple shadow across the valleys, Clara felt the last remnants of her loneliness melt away. The physical fortress of stone had protected her body, but the giant cowboy's vow had finally claimed her soul. They sat down to a quiet dinner together, the silence between them no longer a cold barrier of secrets, but a warm, shared understanding of the war that was inevitably coming. A war they were now fully prepared to fight as one. Autumn arrived in the Texas hill country not with a sudden drop in temperature, but with a subtle golden shift in the light that bathed the rugged limestone ridges of the North Ridge. The deep green leaves of the ancient live oaks began to fade into muted shades of rust and amber, and the evening breezes carried a crisp, dry sharpness that signaled the end of the brutal summer heat. For 2 months, a fragile yet beautiful peace had settled over the Vance homestead. The shared sweat of managing the vast estate had forged an unbreakable bond between Gideon and Clara. They no longer spoke as strangers bound by a cold legal contract. They spoke as partners who shared quiet morning coffees on the wide stone porch, their eyes communicating a deep mutual respect that did not require words. The omniscient observer of the valley, however, knew that this serene autumn calm was merely the eye of a devastating storm, waiting to test the true strength of the fortress they had built together. The boycott from Oakhaven had intensified, driven by the venomous persistence of Beatrice Cole. The town merchants refused to sell grain salt or basic domestic supplies to anyone representing the Vance Ranch, forcing Gideon to bypass the town entirely and haul goods from a smaller settlement 20 miles to the west. Yet inside the stone house, Clara had transformed the hollow rooms into a sanctuary of warmth and order. The curtains she had sewn from plain caliche-colored muslin now hung elegantly in the windows, and the scent of fresh golden bread constantly filled the air. Gideon's hardened, weathered face had softened over the weeks. He smiled more often, his gray eyes losing the defensive sharpness that had kept the world at bay for years. They had found an emotional alignment in each other's isolation, an unspoken agreement that on this soil they were safe. That sanctuary was shattered on a late October afternoon when a lone rider galloped down the gravel driveway, his horse lathered in sweat. It was Marcus Webb, the senior agent from the Pinkerton Detective Agency, whom Gideon had hired weeks ago. His face was grim, his leather saddlebags heavy with documents, as he stepped into the living room where Gideon and Clara were reviewing the ranch's winter tallies. Webb did not waste time on pleasantries. He placed a thick, wax-sealed envelope onto the heavy oak dining table. "I have spent the last 6 weeks in Topeka, Mervance," Webb began, his voice weary but sharp. "The evidence we gathered is ironclad. We managed to suborn 2 of Vaughn's junior clerks who were riddled with guilt over what happened to your wife. We discovered that Vaughn did not stop with Clara, After she fled, he continued his systematic embezzlement, utilizing the exact same methods, the exact same dummy accounts, and forging the signatures of his new secretaries. 2 weeks ago, the federal authorities caught him. The bank's books have been fully audited, and Vaughn is currently being held under a $20,000 bond. Clara gasped, her hand flying to the silver locket around her neck. Tears of intense relief welling in her eyes. "Then it is over," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The truth is out. I'm finally free." "Not yet, Mrs. Vance," Webb interrupted gently, his expression darkening. "Vaughn is a desperate, powerful man with expensive lawyers. The Kansas federal prosecutor has officially reopened the original grand jury case. Because Vaughn utilized your private signature stamp on the earliest fraudulent transactions, his defense team is claiming that you were the true mastermind who corrupted him and that he merely copied your methods later. The prosecutor has ironclad evidence of Vaughn's guilt, but he needs one vital piece to secure a conviction and clear your name permanently. He needs you." Gideon stepped forward, his massive frame instantly casting a protective shadow over his wife, his brow furrowing deeply. "What does that mean, Agent Webb?" "It means a federal subpoena has been issued," Webb explained, looking directly into Gideon's piercing gray eyes. "Clara must physically travel back to Topeka. She must stand in that courtroom, look the judge in the eye, and deliver her testimony directly to the jury. If she does, Vaughn will go to prison for 20 years and her record will be wiped completely clean. But there is the immense risk. Vaughn still has allies in the local marshal's office in Kansas. The moment she steps off the train in Topeka, before she can even reach the courthouse, those corrupt deputies have the legal authority to arrest her based on the original outstanding fugitive warrant. She could be thrown into a county jail cell without bail, completely isolated." "No," Gideon boomed, his deep baritone vibrating through the stone walls like thunder. He slammed his massive, calloused hand onto the table, his eyes burning with a terrifying protective fury. "I did not sign a marriage contract and swear an oath to protect my wife just to send her back into the wolf's den. I will not allow her to board a train to Kansas where corrupt lawmen can lock her in a cage. She stays here on the North Ridge. Let the federal prosecutors ride to Texas if they want her words." "Gideon, please," Clara said softly, her voice remarkably calm despite the terror fluttering in her chest. She stepped closer to his massive form, reaching out with her bandaged hand, the hand that had healed into a thin silver scar, and placing it against his broad chest. She could feel the furious, heavy rhythm of his heart. She looked up into his hardened face, her eyes filled with an unbreakable, quiet dignity. "Look at me, husband." Gideon lowered his gaze, the fierce anger in his eyes faltering slightly as he looked into her clear, beautiful face. "I have spent nearly a year running from ghosts hiding in the dark storage rooms of general stores and trembling at the sound of the Oak Haven gossip." Clara said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried immense strength. "You offered me a fortress, and you gave me your name. But I cannot live the rest of my life behind these limestone walls like a prisoner who is merely tolerated. I want to walk into Oak Haven with my head held high. I want to build a family with you in the light of day without fearing the arrival of a federal marshal every time the wind blows from the north. I want to be your wife in every way that matters. I have to go back. I have to face him." Gideon stared at her, his massive chest heaving as he waged a silent war within his own soul. The omniscient narrator who had traced the lines of his lonely life knew that his greatest fear was not violence or death. His greatest fear was losing the one person who had finally understood his gentle heart. He looked at her small hand against his chest, realizing that her courage was equal to his own physical strength. "If you go, Clara," Gideon said, his voice cracking with an uncharacteristic vulnerability, "the law might take you from me before I can pull you back. Then do not let me go alone." Clara replied, a fierce, beautiful smile breaking through her tears. "Ride with me. Stand beside me in that courtroom just as you stood beside me on the courthouse steps. Be my shield." Gideon looked at her for a long, agonizing moment, the silence of the house stretching until the tension was almost unbearable. Slowly, the hard, unyielding lines of his face settled into a resolution that was grander than any stone wall. He reached up, covering her small hand with his own giant palm. "Get your carpetbag packed, Clara," Gideon commanded quietly, his gray eyes burning with absolute definitive fire. "Agent Webb, prepare the horses and secure 3 tickets on the Northern Express train out of San Antonio. If the state of Kansas wants a trial, they are going to get one, but they will have to face both of us. As the darkness of night finally enveloped the hill country, the gnarled live oaks rustled in a rising northern wind. The legal contract that had brought them together had finally evolved into something far greater, a sacred, indomitable alliance. Tomorrow they would leave their sanctuary behind to march directly into the heart of the storm, ready to tear Vaughn's empire of lies down to the bedrock together. The bitter winter of Kansas was no match for the ironclad resolve that had marched out of the Texas hill country. The federal courtroom in Topeka was filled to capacity, the suffocating air thick with the scent of wet wool, wood smoke, and intense anticipation. For 3 days, Vaughn's expensive defense attorneys had tried to dismantle Clara's character, painting her as a manipulative thief who had stolen from the vault and vanished into the night. But their manufactured lies completely disintegrated when Clara took the witness stand. Guided by the omniscient hand of justice, she stood before the judge and the jury, her voice ringing with an absolute, unflinching clarity that transfixed every soul in the room. She presented the physical signature stamps, the meticulously cross-referenced banking ledgers uncovered by the Pinkertons, and recounted the exact details of Vaughn's predation. Sitting directly behind her in the front spectator row, the towering, massive figure of Gideon Vance remained perfectly still, his piercing gray eyes fixed on the defense table like an executioner's gaze. The sheer physical and moral authority of the giant rancher provided a shield so powerful that Vaughn's corrupt allies in the local marshal's office dared not even step forward to enforce the outdated fugitive warrant. When the jury returned after less than 2 hours of deliberation, the verdict was absolute. Vaughn was found guilty on all counts of grand embezzlement, forgery, and malicious defamation. The courtroom erupted into a frenzy of murmurs as the disgraced bank president was handcuffed and led away to serve a 20-year sentence in the state penitentiary. The federal judge officially expounded a full exoneration for Clara, wiping her record completely clean and awarding her a substantial financial restitution for the immense damages done to her name. As Clara stepped down from the stand, her eyes wet with tears of profound relief, Gideon moved forward to meet her. He didn't care about the staring crowds or the flashing cameras of the newspapers. He simply reached out his giant calloused hands and pulled his wife into a fierce protective embrace, his deep baritone whispering against her hair. "It is over, Clara. The truth has won. Let's go home." Their return to Oak Haven, Texas was nothing short of a triumph. The news of the federal trial and Clara's total innocence had traveled down the telegraph wires faster than the express train, completely transforming the social landscape of the valley. When Gideon and Clara rode their horses down the main Kalishi street of the town, the very same boardwalks that had once lined with silent, hostile faces were now filled with people looking at them with deep shame and newfound reverence. Shopkeepers stepped out to tip their hats, and the local sheriff nodded respectfully as they passed. Beatrice Cole stood alone on the porch of the dry goods store, her posture withered, her eyes downcast, as her reign of terror and malicious gossip came to a humiliating end. Gideon and Clara did not pause, nor did they look back. They rode past the town's petty hypocrisy without a single word, leaving the dust of Oak Haven's malice behind them forever as they headed into the sanctuary of the North Ridge. The narrator, observing the passage of time across the sprawling valley, watched the seasons bleed into one another in a beautiful, sweeping harmony. The thousands of acres of rugged limestone land flourished under their shared stewardship. With her name fully cleared and the financial restitution secured, Clara expanded the ranch's domestic operations, establishing a massive, thriving orchard and a modern dairy that provided high-quality goods across the territory, breaking the town's original boycott entirely. The stone homestead was no longer a lonely fortress of survival. It was a vibrant, sprawling home filled with the warmth of hand-woven rugs, the laughter of guests, and the constant sweet aroma of fresh baking. The legal contract that had once bound them as practical business partners had long since dissolved into a deep, consuming love, a sacred alliance forged in the fires of adversity and nurtured by a profound mutual devotion. Decades passed over the hill country, turning the gnarled live oaks older and stronger, their deep roots gripping the limestone bedrock just like the family legacy that had taken hold in the soil. On a quiet, golden November afternoon in 1921, Clara Vance sat in a comfortable wicker rocking chair on the wide stone porch, a thick wool shawl wrapped around her frail shoulders. Her hair had turned into a beautiful snow-white halo, and her hands, which had once baked bread in a dark storage room and bled in the smokehouse, were now wrinkled and soft with age. Gideon had passed away 3 winters prior, his giant frame finally resting beneath the shade of the ancient oaks on the northern ridge. He loved so dearly, but his presence was alive in every blade of grass, every stone of the house, and every breath of the wind. Sitting on the porch steps beside her was her adult daughter Sarah, who possessed her father's striking gray eyes and her mother's fierce, quiet dignity. In the green pasture below, several happy grandchildren were chasing a newborn Hereford calf, their laughter echoing through the serene valley. "You're thinking about him, aren't you, Ma?" Sarah asked softly, leaning her head against her mother's knee. Clara smiled, her faded eyes looking out at the beautiful sun-drenched horizon where the Texas sun was beginning to dip below the blue ridges, casting a majestic crimson light over their vast land. She reached down, her old fingers gently touching the silver locket that still hung securely around her neck. "I'm thinking about the choice, Sarah," Clara replied, her voice frail but filled with an echo of that unbreakable strength that had defined her youth. "I'm thinking about the terrified young woman who took a single carpetbag and rode up into these forbidden hills to meet a man the world called a monster. It was the most dangerous gamble of my life and the most beautiful." Sarah squeezed her mother's hand gently. "You built an empire out of these rocks, Ma. You and Pa won against everything they threw at you. You did good." Clara closed her eyes, the rhythmic rocking of her chair matching the steady, peaceful heartbeat of the valley she had conquered, the omniscient eye that had watched her entire journey from the flower-dusted counters of Kansas to the hostile courthouse of Oak Haven and finally to this majestic porch, knew the ultimate truth of her existence. The secret to a beautiful life was never a path free of storms. It was having the immense courage to stop running, to stand tall against the world's lies, and to find that one solitary soul who could see your true heart and choose to build a fortress of love beside you anyway. And as the darkness of the Texas night gently enveloped the homestead, bringing a quiet final peace to her tired body, Clara smiled into the shadows, knowing that her story in every way that counted was a magnificent and perfect one.